You're listening to the OCF Crosspoint podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to sharing stories of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of the OCF Crosspoint podcast. I'm Josh Jackson, host of Crosspoint and senior designer at Officers Christian Fellowship. Today's story of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession deals with the topic of moral injury. For those not familiar with moral injury, while it is similar to PTSD in some ways, it's very much a different type of psychological trauma. Let me share a few thoughts with you from the National Center for PTSD, and I quote, "Moral injury is a construct that describes extreme and unprecedented life experience, including the harmful aftermath of exposure to such events. These events are considered morally injurious if they transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Thus, the key precondition for moral injury is an act of transgression, which shatters moral and ethical expectations that are rooted in religious or spiritual beliefs, or culture-based, organizational, and group-based rules about fairness, the value of life, and so forth." The site goes on to share a couple examples of types of moral injury, the first of which might stem from an unintentional error that leads to the loss of life of non-combatants. And the second type is a result of transgressive acts of others. Now, in this instance, service members can be morally injured by the transgression of their peers and leaders who betray expectations in egregious ways. Again, that information comes from the National Center for PTSD, and you can find more information online at www.ptsd.va.gov. I'll be sure to include a link to this site and any other resources mentioned in today's episode. Just be sure to point your browser to ocfusa.org/crosspoint and click on this episode to read the show notes. Okay, recently, former OCF Director of Field Operations, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Schmidt, U.S. Army retired, sat down with retired Army Colonel Dave Batchelor in the faculty lounge of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College to talk about moral injury. And during their conversation, Colonel Batchelor shared the candid story of his personal struggle with moral injury. So let's jump into the conversation now as they discuss the impact of moral injury at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
We're sitting here with Colonel Retired David Batchelor, U.S. Army. And today we're going to talk about moral injury, the subject of moral injury. I first knew Dave when he was a young major attending the Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and we struck up a very warm and lifelong relationship. Followed him through his career and attended his change of command when he took command of the 1st of the 41st Infantry at Fort Riley, Kansas, back in 2004. Immediately after taking command, he deployed with that battalion to Iraq and experienced some significant struggles in combat, and even in the leadership situation he was placed into there in Iraq. And we're going to talk to David today about some of those experiences and their impact, particularly around the subject of moral injury. David, let me ask you to just share a little bit more about your background, where you came from, and how you were led into this military career through God's calling.
Sure, thank you. I was raised in a military home, not a Christian home. I'm a military brat. My dad served for 36 years. He enlisted in 1936 and retired in 72. I served for just over 31 years, 28 plus on active duty. I was an infantry officer. More importantly, I've been married almost 32 years, and I am a Christian. So I enlisted in 1982, and I was commissioned on active duty in 1986. And I served in various assignments from lieutenant to colonel. I have 5 combat tours or operational deployments to include peacekeeping in the Balkans and combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And now I understand that you're team leader in the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. teaching young captains and majors at the operational level of warfare. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct.
And I just want to add that Dave is also a critical helper, in fact, designer of the Integrated Faith Project that the OCF is going to be fielding in July of this year. So very helpful on the integration of faith in profession, family, personal transformation, and in community and relationships. So thank you, David, first of all, for doing that, but thank you also for joining us to talk about this subject of moral injury.
My pleasure.
Would you tell us why this subject is important?
It's very important to me personally for several reasons. First, I watched my own soldiers from the battalion and the brigade and eventually other veterans struggle with this idea of behavioral health, moral injury, and even PTSD in some cases. And then I struggle personally in my experience coming back from Iraq with regard to my own behavioral manifestations in the Army, now in civilian life, and even in dealing with the VA. To put it shortly, watching my soldiers struggle and watching myself in retrospect and my own experience coming back home.
So tell us a little bit more about your struggle.
So my experience started when we were redeploying the battalion from Iraq in 2005. We did some screening, some behavioral health testing, and we realized that we had a number of soldiers out of an 800-plus battalion in the 90s, somewhere was a specific number, who were struggling with something behaviorally. And then we did a deeper dive than what the Army provided for us using the chain of command. And we identified what we called high-risk soldiers, about 45 of that 90-plus. And then I thought I was on the cutting edge of something important. I thought I was taking care of my soldiers the right way. And I reached back to my garrison in my division from which my battalion came from. And while they were very willing to help, and were very willing to do screening once we redeployed and follow-up care, there was a stigma associated with just asking for the help. And I realized then that we were on the edge of something that we didn't know a whole lot about. For me specifically, I struggled for a while with bouts of anger, and in retrospect, probably bouts of depression as well, but was too embarrassed to talk about it with anyone. And it wasn't until my wife got my attention, pointing to our children, our 5 children, and telling me that what I'm witnessing with them are direct reflections of me. And that's what it took to get my attention, that something was not the way it had been before.
Well, let me go back to something you said. You said that when your soldiers came back and you brought up this subject after you did an assessment, and you said, "I thought I was taking care of my soldiers," your exact words. And yet, there seemed to be a lack of a response. How did that affect you?
So that increased or exacerbated my desire to defend my soldiers and actually everything that I find important. I tell people I have a collie-like mentality. I've always been one to kind of circle around my family, my people, my organization, my unit, whatever I think I'm responsible for. That's interesting because our research shows that people like me who have a strong value system, who are Christians or even just very religious or values-based, can be more susceptible to this idea of a moral injury.
And why is that?
It gets to a work I read by Dr. Shea, who was on the cutting edge of understanding or differentiating moral injury from PTSD and other behavioral health issues. It gets to a Greek term called the themis, which is a better way to describe what we would say here in North America is your body, mind, value system, the seat or your core of what you believe to be right. So part of my struggle is linked to those definitions of what PTSD is, what moral injury is, or what we think it is, and how people put labels on psychoses or on behavioral health issues. I am anything but a doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist. I'm amateur at those things at best, though well-read. But what was groundbreaking for me was the understanding of the root causes of PTSD compared to the root causes of moral injury. PTSD, from our research, particularly what we see in the VA and the National Center for PTSD in the VA, as well as the National Institute for Mental Health, says that PTSD is a behavioral or a mental or psychological issue associated with a traumatic experience. And it's fairly easy to diagnose because it requires manifestations of certain behaviors associated with it.
For example,
hypersensitivity, avoidance, numbness, and especially the re-experiencing of symptoms. Some people, in layman's terms, liken PTSD to a fear-based response. On the other hand, moral injury is different because it's based on your values. Something or a series of things has occurred to someone that is so egregious to their core values of what they think is right that their behavior changes subconsciously and many times unknowingly when there's some set of stimulus that challenges them in the same manner.
Well, let me ask you to personalize that, Dave. What are the core values that you would say are a part of Colonel Dave Batchelor that have been violated and that have resulted in injury in your own self?
Sure. That's why I mentioned the piece about being a military brat. Mm-hmm. I use that term affectionately for military dependents. And I was one of those. As I think I said, my dad served 36 years. And in our value system, in our familial value system, we kind of worshiped the state and the Army, and we valued patriotic service as being one of the most important things a young person could do. And I confess, as a Christian, that many times in my own career, in my 32 years of service, that I idolize the institution. And then when I'm placed in a traumatic situation where I feel like the institution is turning on my subordinates, my soldiers, that's when my thymus began to be cracked. Something so egregious happened when I felt like the organization was not taking care of my people. It was a sense of betrayal. A sense of betrayal from the very thing I had idolized. And while that idolization wasn't healthy, particularly for a Christian, it was where I was at, and I think that led to my struggle with moral injury. How that manifests with me specifically are bouts of anger leading to bouts of self-righteous indignation, many times leading to some of the physical manifestations, which include sleeplessness or poor sleep patterns, and headaches and depression. The research also seems to point to a higher rate of suicide among veterans or those associated with moral injury, even more so than those who are diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Dave, could you just give us one example of how you thought the essence, your values, were supremely violated in combat, and perhaps one following combat as well?
No, I'd be glad to, and I have dozens of these. This is just the one that popped in my head first. The battalion task force, had been in a significant firefight that went about 6 or 8 hours the day prior. And in that fight, it was our first day in that part of Baghdad, and we had really taken it to the enemy, so to speak, but we did have casualties. We estimate through some feeds and intelligence that we had probably killed 100 enemy combatants. But in that fight, I lost a precious U.S. serviceman, one of my squad leaders, and I had 5 soldiers wounded, 3 very seriously injured, is the way the Army puts it. So the next day, we were to lay out our equipment and inspect it, repair, refit, refuel, do maintenance on all of our weapons and systems, and then return back to the fight. And my brigade commander said, "Hey, Dave, that was a great fight yesterday, and I need you to get back out there and get after it, but the division commander is coming by, and I think it would be powerful for him to spend a few minutes with your soldiers doing your pre-combat inspections of your equipment. So just let him walk around, make sure he sees the extent of the firefight yesterday, through your damaged equipment and vehicles." So the division commander walks up at the time and shook his hand, and I walk him over to a squad of infantrymen and a platoon of tankers. And the commanding general walks over to talk to them, and as they're laying out their equipment, he notices the damage to the equipment. Ball bearings from IEDs stuck in helmets, ball bearings stuck in armor plates and kit with blood on it from the fight the day before, and damage to combat vehicles. And as he walks up to the first soldier, and I'm going to give you a direct quote here, he said, "Tell me about your day yesterday." The soldier says, "Well, sir, we were in some shit yesterday, but we kind of took it to them, and we're going to go back out there and do it again today." And then suddenly and almost inexplicably, the division commander began shouting. My perception was at the top of his lungs. Turns his back to that platoon of soldiers and starts screaming at the brigade commander about why he let our soldiers in combat the day before in that portion of the city. And I will tell you that left a deep-seated sense of betrayal by the institution or by my profession that I thought would have praised and lauded my soldiers for their brave actions, but instead gave the appearance of doing just the opposite. And it was inexplicable and almost unrecoverable for my soldiers, that sense of betrayal, because they thought they had done something noble and brave, courageous, and duty-centric, only to hear the commanding general take another tact for probably a different reason.
Well, that's pretty graphic, and certainly makes the point that leaders can do great damage as well as can do great good if they're not careful. Has there been something since then, since combat, where that kind of leadership betrayal was reinforced?
Yes, it had to do with just bringing the battalion back to the garrison there, and the way that my organization was treated, the way that we were labeled, labels associated with us because we had 45 what we called serious cases or soldiers that were high risk. And for me personally, it's manifested itself in sometimes a hatred and definitely anger towards what I deem to be poor leadership. That and bureaucracy are the two triggers for me that can send me off the deep end with my anger and my desire to attack windmills.
I had a chaplain once told me that moral injury, he shortened it into MTDW. My theology don't work. And maybe the better title would be my core values don't fit with my experience. But he did use the word my theology. And you've mentioned that perhaps you had a theology of worshiping a profession, the profession of arms. How does that fit in your experience?
What you describe, it gets to the core of my own experience. Like so many people, when you come to Christ, we don't think about the sacrifices. We don't think about the hard things. We don't think about the fact that we live in a fallen, broken world. Many of us falsely believe that once I became a Christian, these kinds of bad things are not supposed to happen to me. When you're selected for command, which is a pretty tough cut in the military, roughly 14 or 15% at the battalion level, you begin to think that I'm being blessed. And in fact, you are being blessed, because it's an amazing privilege to command our nation's treasure, their people, their soldiers. And so for me, in my own theology, since you use that word, I felt like you take a moral leader who's a Christian, who's trying to take directions from God, and the Holy Spirit, and the Bible, that things are supposed to work out a little differently. So it's one thing to have soldiers injured or wounded in combat, and you kind of expect that, and as ugly and as egregious as that can be, for me personally, in my value system, it paled in comparison to what I perceived as the institution turning on my soldiers. And little things, or things that appear little, are greatly enhanced through the lens of combat. The smallest thing that may seem trite or petty becomes the biggest thing when your themis is broken, or when you perceive that someone is offending your organization, or even what you thought to be right.
So your response then would be outside the norm, outside what was effective, outside what you would hope to, how you would hope to respond. Is that right?
That's right. For me specifically, it manifests itself in being quick to anger.
Okay.
And being quick to defend, and I call it the Don Quixote syndrome. I've never seen a windmill too small for me to assault it, particularly if I deem that windmill to be something that is impacting or threatening something I think I'm responsible for, whether it's my family or my organization that I work in, or me personally. I even have that problem many times in my own church or chapel. When I perceive somebody is an affront to good order and discipline in the organization, or has offended somebody in that organization, I am quick to anger and confrontation, and then subsequent self-aggrandizement, and especially the idea that I'm somehow ascendant morally. And none of those things are very valuable to the kingdom, or even for your own behavioral health.
Well, Dave, you left combat in 2005 as a battalion commander. You've been deployed since, and in tough situations also, where you've seen leadership failures and probably have had this challenge reinforced in your own life. But you've been retired for how many years now?
Almost 4 years.
4 years. You're in a very prominent and challenging position as leading other instructors, teaching mid-grade officers here. You're a man of stature in this community. Are you still struggling?
I am.
And tell me, 4 years after retirement, in the civilian sector or outside of the uniformed sector, how you're still affected.
So all the original physical manifestations are still present. Even yesterday, when conflict happened, and it's minor conflict, but when conflict happened in my place of work, I found myself having to stop, compose myself before giving a response when I felt like my organization was being challenged. One of the powerful tools or weapons that I have employed to help myself, first of all, is just through reading about what moral injury is.
So you're just saying self-awareness.
Self-awareness is a big deal.
Okay.
And in fact, that might have been the first step to my healing. My wife got my attention by pointing to behaviors of my kids where they were mimicking my behavior. And then I began to read a little bit. And in particular, I read Dr. Shea's work, Achilles in Vietnam. And although portions of it are very clinical, there are dozens of accounts from veterans from Vietnam that were struggling with either PTSD, moral injury, or some other psychoses. And when I read the first 2 chapters of that book, I realized that these were mentally men who had done dangerous things, and yet they were struggling with something they didn't understand. And that went very far in helping me see myself and realizing I wasn't by myself in the struggle.
You mentioned Achilles in Vietnam by Dr. Shea, Jonathan Shea, published in 1994, obviously around the similar problem that Vietnamese veterans had experienced. Have you found that to be one of the best resources?
For me personally, yes. There are many out there, particularly since this one was published. But to my understanding, Dr. Shea was the first person that pitched an idea not to lump all behavioral issues into one basket. And I want to go back to that point I made up front about why it matters that there's a difference between moral injury and other psychoses and PTSD. In my subtribal culture in combat arms and as an infantryman, if you challenge me and say that my behavioral health was because of something that was traumatic or fear-based, I have a hard time overcoming my cultural pride to admit that I have a problem.
Because your sub-tribe is a combat arms leader, willing to sacrifice life and putting other people's life at risk. That is a challenge to the moral essence of who you are.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right or wrong, that's exactly correct. And while as a leader, I hope I gave my soldiers the license and the ability to seek help for whatever the root cause of their problem was, for me, I drew a different standard as the key leader. And so I ran from the concept of PTSD or any type of psychoses because of that stigma and my self-implied stigma.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is interesting. We started a program called Combat Trauma Small Groups with husbands and wives of returning veterans who were struggling with combat trauma. We had very few takers because of the stigma, I assume, of saying I am a victim of combat trauma. We use crew militaries' excellent program called the Combat Trauma Healing Manual, along with the one for the spouse, which is called When War Comes Home. What is interesting to me was that we had very few takers to attend this small group, which was meant to be private and healing, except for chaplains and some medical personnel who probably are more aware of the psychological makeup of themselves, more sensitive, and maybe less of the tribal culture of a combat arms officer. Would you see that as possible?
Absolutely. I think that might be the norm. Mm-hmm. And when I began to explore or talk about the concept of moral injury, I had many discussions and sometimes arguments with seniors in the Army health system, psychologists and psychiatrists, who had not thought about or had disclaimed the idea of a moral injury. This is not to say that they are not great doctors, but at least the Army as an institution had not really differentiated between different types of behavioral health issues or manifestations. The chaplains, on the other hand, and I think it gets back to some of their core functions and values, we're quick to come up on the net and say, there may be a difference, and labeling people all under one bucket or basket of problems is damaging and unhelpful. As well, the VA has come on board and has done a lot of research and has hung a lot of products out there where they differentiate between the diagnosis of PTSD and moral injury or some other type of psychosis or injury.
Dave, I want to go back to what we started with a few minutes ago, and that was how have you found the ability to mitigate some of the challenges of moral injury? And the first one you said was self-awareness. I am now more aware of where my buttons get pushed. Are there other things that you have found helpful in dealing with moral injury?
Absolutely.
And being a fully functional leader as you are right now in a prominent position?
Absolutely. For me personally, I needed a little time, and sometimes time and space, from what I call flash to bang. Example would be someone walks in and says or does something that I perceive to be threatening at whatever level to something I care about, whether it's a group in the chapel, my Sunday school class, my family, my organization that I work with here in the college. So I began to pray specifically that the Lord would give me time to stop, go back to a more rational self, and then craft a response if necessary, as opposed to flying right into anger. I also specifically prayed that the Lord would show me which windmills, if you follow the analogy, were mine to assail. Mm-hmm. And the realization that every time something happens in this world, it is not a personal affront against me or my organization. And I found that praying about those two things, time and space, and which problems are really mine and which ones warrant my attention to that degree, has helped me a lot. There's also two scriptures that I think are pretty profound and powerful as well. The first one is in John 10:10, words to the effect that Jesus came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. And I found that walking around angry or quick to anger or quick to perceive an affront is not the way Jesus intended me to be. And oh, by the way, because of my theology, I have no doubt that our Lord knew a million years before any of this ever happened what my responses would be. And he's simply waiting for me to lean on him for that time and space. The other verse tied to that is one of my favorites, and that's Galatians 5:1, which can be easily mishandled or misinterpreted, but the essence is, it was for freedom's sake that Christ came. And so I should no longer be shackled to whatever behavioral health problems manifest themselves. And then finally, the third thing I did, besides seek the scriptures and self-awareness and some research, was I finally went and talked to somebody about it. What I was challenged with specifically was this concept of survivor guilt, and this concept that as a commander, I was responsible for everything my unit does or fails to do. And while that is absolutely right and a great part of the warrior ethos and part of leadership, in the kingdom, taken to the extreme, that is not a godly response. And what my dear sister who challenged me on this said was, David, did you make good decisions? Did you make the best decisions that you could make with the information that you had? Did you share danger and hardship on a routine basis? Did the enemy get a vote? Did you do everything that you could to protect your organization, both from within and from without? And my answer was yes. And then she challenged me and said, then you're setting yourself up to be your own God when you hold yourself to a higher standard than you would ever hold one of your subordinates. It made my hair stand up on my head even more straight than it does now. And it took away what I had as my license to be self-righteous and indignant, quick to anger, and assailing windmills that weren't necessarily mine to attack.
At the risk of being clinical, let me summarize what I think I heard you say. Your first helpful response was awareness. Awareness that, yes, you were injured. Yes, this is what it's about. Yes, all of the things that you told us, that it's about a values-based, theology-based, commitments and things like that. The second was you asked for time and space to pray to God that your response to an action will be an appropriate reaction.
That's right.
And then the third, which you so powerfully expressed, is I have to realize I'm not God. I only have a part of the puzzle is mine. So thank you for that. Now, you're a unique individual. Other people have other values. Other people have other experiences. What hope would you give them as they struggle with some of the damage done in their own lives?
Sure, and I don't remember if I said, I'm definitely not a doctor or a psychologist, and I'm speaking strictly from my own experience. And I do understand that there are first responders and all kinds of people that have different experiences that can still experience moral injury. And it may manifest itself in slightly different ways. For me, awareness, regardless, is still a big item that needs to be addressed. And when my former soldiers, or even friends who weren't soldiers, manifest some symptoms of some kind of injury, I'm quick to point to resources to help them understand they're not alone. Probably, for me, though, the biggest thing is faith-based, and going back to my Lord in prayer and asking for that help, which is beyond me. And I don't know if that answered your question, but I acknowledge that my experience is unique, and my means of dealing with it is specific for me as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you for giving us those scripture verses. Where would you direct someone who wants to know more? What resources would you direct them to?
Sure. First of all, download or buy a copy of Achilles in Vietnam by Dr. Jonathan Shea. Although it's not the most recent research and it's dated, for me personally, and especially coming from my subtribal military culture, it was very powerful in helping me see myself and understand my soldiers. The other thing is there's lots of sites on the interweb, but the National Center for PTSD, again, there's a label, but that's what it's called, on the VA is accessible through the interweb. So someone can go on there and get lots of helps that will help them understand exactly what they're experiencing. Another article that I found very powerful, and I believe that it was based on some research by Duke University. It was published originally in the Journal for Religious Health. And it starts with a brief explanation and a differentiation of PTSD and moral injury, but then it gives you a test to take, kind of like a behavioral health test, but kind of Myers-Briggs, based on a scale from 1 to 10. And it's based on good research from other veterans who have taken the test, and it is written specifically to determine moral injury versus other types of behavioral health challenges. Taking that test and sharing this test with others, and even sharing my results with my wife, has been powerful for me and for us as a family. I wanted to speak a minute about what someone who is a loved one of somebody with PTSD or moral injury or any other kind of behavioral health challenge. First of all, I tell you to hang in there. My wife waited about 4 years before she had finally had enough and was able to point out what I was doing to my own family. I went from probably 2005 until 2009 before she really had my full attention. The second thing or advice I would give to a loved one of somebody struggling is to attempt to be understanding and attempt to not take those manifestations personal. That doesn't mean they should be a doormat by any means. But I watch my wife struggle with what has happened to my husband, why is he behaving this way, and what shortcomings am I manifesting that drive him to this? And the answer is none. My wife just had not shared the same experiences. Her thymus was still intact, but now her understanding about where I'm coming from is powerful. And she's been able to minister to and talk to other women who have experienced the same thing. So don't give up. Don't be a doormat. And help your significant other see themselves and to get some help. Again, mine was a result of prayer, self-study, and finally finding some people that used terms other than PTSD, which in my case were U.S. Army chaplains and the behavioral health professionals at the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA.
I want to just mention a couple of other things. This man of God who has been touched deeply by war and all of the ramifications of war is a passionate man in the issue of encouraging, of exemplifying the power of servant leadership. Some of that I just have to believe is attributed to some of the tough things, the refiner's fire that God has brought you through, that you could serve Him more powerfully. So thank you, David, and thank you for giving your time.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Crosspoint. If you or someone you know may be struggling with a moral injury, we encourage you to seek out help today. If you'd like us to pray for you, you can send a confidential prayer request, either via email to podcast@ocfusa.org or through our website by pointing your browser to ocfusa.org/pray. Until next time, remember the words of David from Psalm 16:8. I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With Him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Amen.
The views expressed by the hosts and guests of Crosspoint do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Officers Christian Fellowship of the United States of America, its governing council, staff, or of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. For more information about Officers Christian Fellowship, go to ocfusa.org.